I used to think the worst sound in the world was a thunderstorm breaking over the roof of our old house. I was wrong. The worst sound is laughter. Laughter that isn't for you, but at you. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a story like this one. That night, the dining table glowed beneath warm pendant lights. Madison had arranged everything the way she liked it. Linen napkins folded sharp, wine glasses catching light like tiny mirrors. I sat at the far end, my hearing aid buzzing faintly, trying to follow their conversation. They spoke fast, their words overlapping, young voices quick and confident. Mine had grown slow with age. "Dad," Eric said without looking up from his plate, "pass the bread to Maddie, would you?" I reached for the basket, hands trembling slightly. Madison smiled, but it wasn't kindness. It was the kind of smile people wear before a punchline. "You know what's funny?" she said, turning to the kids. "Your grandpa keeps his hearing aid on full volume, but still pretends to understand what we're saying." The children giggled. Eric looked uncomfortable for half a second, then laughed too. I tried to laugh along, but my chest tightened. I placed the bread near her plate and said softly, "Sometimes I just enjoy listening." She leaned toward me, voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Oh, you enjoy listening, do you? Then maybe you'll enjoy silence more." Her manicured fingers reached behind my ear, a quick click, and the world went dead. The hum, the chatter, the clinking, all gone. She had switched off my hearing aid. Their laughter blurred into quiet motion. I saw mouths moving, forks scraping, but no sound reached me. My pulse beat loud in my skull. My eyes met Eric's. He looked away, pretending to pour wine. I sat still, not out of shock, but calculation. Years of work had taught me that reacting too soon gives your power away. So I stayed calm, folded my hands, and watched their silent faces move across the table like ghosts. When dinner ended, Madison waved toward me, still smirking. "Good night, Luke," she mouthed exaggeratedly, as though speaking to a child. I nodded, rose slowly, and left the room. In my bedroom, I turned the hearing aid back on. The sudden return of sound filled the silence like a tide. Through the thin wall, I heard their laughter continuing, careless, full. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the framed photo of Helen beside the lamp. Her smile, captured 30 years ago, still looked warm enough to touch. "I think I finally understand what you meant," I whispered. "You used to say, 'Luke, silence can heal or destroy. Depends who controls it.'" That night, I realized she was right. I had spent years letting silence destroy me. When Eric stopped visiting after his marriage, when Madison slowly took control of the finances I once managed, when my home became her stage, I told myself it was temporary. That family always corrects itself, but families don't correct themselves. People do, when they've had enough. I removed the hearing aid, placed it on the table, and stared at the ceiling. Fan turning lazily above. The house creaked like it was thinking. I replayed the moment, her fingers touching my ear, the laughter, Eric's indifference. My humiliation was quiet but complete. And yet, beneath that silence, something else stirred, a calm I hadn't felt in years, the kind of calm a man feels when he stops hoping for respect and starts planning for dignity. When I finally lay down, the noise of the world had softened into something distant. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. Tomorrow, I told myself, I'd start listening differently, not to their words, but to the forgotten truths echoing beneath this roof. I closed my eyes to the faint rhythm of the house settling around me. Somewhere in another room, they were still laughing. They didn't know the sound of their laughter would be the last thing they ever took for granted. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the echo of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that makes you remember everything you've done for people who no longer see you. When morning came, sunlight slipped through the blinds and landed on the old photograph of Helen that sat on my nightstand. She was holding Eric as a baby, both smiling at something outside the frame. For a long moment, I stared at it until the edges blurred. I reached out, tracing Helen's face with my fingertip. "You'd tell me to breathe," I whispered, "to let it pass." But Helen wasn't here to see what I'd become, a quiet man tolerated out of obligation. After breakfast, I walked to the porch, coffee trembling in my hands. Madison's car was already gone. She left early every day for her office job. Eric was inside, buried in his laptop, pretending to be busy. That was our new version of father and son, two men sharing a roof, but not a conversation. The wind moved gently through the maple trees outside, whispering like a voice from the past. I thought about the years I'd spent working to buy this very porch, the nails I hammered myself when the contractor fell short, the nights I stayed awake worrying about mortgage payments. Every beam of this house was a scar from my own hands. I still remember the first time I held a paycheck that could cover more than just rent and groceries. I was 23 then, newly married to Helen. She had painted her nails the color of sunrise and waited at the window when I got home. I remember handing her the envelope and saying, "This will build our future." She laughed and kissed my cheek, saying, "Luke, don't build a future. Build memories." So I did both. When Eric was born, the doctor handed me this tiny red-faced bundle, and something inside me changed. I wasn't just a man anymore. I was a provider, a builder of safety. I wanted my boy to grow up without hunger, without fear. I wanted him to study, to have choices, to live easier than I ever did. That dream became my whole identity. I took extra shifts at the electrical plant, climbed frozen towers in the dark of winter, came home with grease on my hands and pain in my back. There were days when I'd barely sleep before heading out again, but I never complained. When I walked through the door and Eric ran into my arms yelling, "Dad!" every ache disappeared. Helen used to warn me, "Don't give too much, Luke. A man who never keeps something for himself ends up invisible." I'd laugh and say, "If he remembers my love, that's enough." I see now how wrong I was. I gave Eric everything, his education, his first car, even the down payment for his house. When he married Madison, I paid half the wedding bills just to make sure he started strong. I never once asked for repayment. Love, I thought, was its own currency. After Helen passed, the house felt too quiet. Eric insisted I move in with them, said it would be easier for everyone. I agreed, thinking it was affection. But slowly, that invitation turned into ownership. My things were pushed into one small room. My name was slowly erased from the bills and the decisions. They called it efficiency. I called it vanishing. It started with little things. Madison took my checkbook for convenience. Then she suggested linking accounts so we can handle everything together. I thought she was being responsible. I didn't realize I was handing her the keys to my life. And through it all, I stayed silent. I told myself it was love again. That old excuse that fathers use when they don't want to face betrayal. Now, sitting on that porch decades later, I finally understood what my silence had cost me. It had taught them that my sacrifices were expected, not appreciated, that I was a relic, not a man. Eric stepped out with his coffee, glancing at me before sitting down across the table. "Mornin', Dad," he said casually. "Morning," I replied. We sat there for a while, both pretending the previous night hadn't happened. The distance between us was heavier than any argument. "Madison didn't mean it," he said finally, eyes on his cup. "You know how she jokes." "Yeah," I said softly. "I know how she jokes." He nodded, relieved that I didn't press further. That's how we lived now, through unfinished sentences and quiet surrenders. After he left for work, I stayed outside, watching the street fill with noise and life. The mail truck stopped by, and I took the bundle inside. Among the letters was one addressed to me, an old pension notice, a reminder of years gone by. I held it for a long time, tracing my name, Luke Anderson, printed in fading ink. That name still meant something. It was on deeds, accounts, contracts. things they had long stopped remembering. I smiled faintly. The world may have forgotten who I was, but paper never lies. Inside, the clock ticked like a metronome of patience. I brewed another cup of coffee, slower this time, and whispered to the empty kitchen, "You built them a life, Luke. Now build yourself one." I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew one thing. The next time Madison looked at me like I was nothing, I would remember every hour I worked, every night I bled for this family, and I would remember that nothing, not even her arrogance, could erase the man who made their comfort possible. The sound of sacrifice wasn't silence after all. It was the steady rhythm of a heart that kept giving until it learned how to take back. It's strange how the people who enter your life quietly often change it the loudest. Madison wasn't a storm when she arrived. She was a breeze pretending to bring spring. I first met her 10 years ago in the living room of my old house. Eric had brought her for Sunday dinner. He was beaming the way young men do when they believe they've found someone who will complete them. Helen had passed by then, and I was still learning how to fill the silence she left behind. Madison walked in carrying a bouquet she hadn't bothered to unwrap. "Mr. Anderson," she said, extending her hand, "I've heard so much about you." She was polite, sharp-eyed, confident. Her voice had that upward tilt at the end of every sentence, the sound of someone used to being listened to. I remember thinking, she's ambitious. She'll either lift him up or swallow him whole. At dinner, she talked more than anyone else. About her job in marketing, about her plans, about how old houses like this have charm but no strategy. I laughed politely. Eric laughed too, not because it was funny, but because he was in love. That night, after they left, I stood by the window watching their car pull away. Something inside me felt unsettled. Helen once told me that real character shows in small gestures, how people treat waiters, old folks, and silence. Madison filled every silence she entered as if quiet made her nervous. Still, I said nothing. My son was happy. That was enough. The wedding came a year later. It was grand, white tents, live music, more guests than I could count. Eric had wanted something simple, but Madison's family insisted on a statement event. I remember standing near the buffet table, hearing people whisper about how modern she was, and how lucky Eric was to have married into her family. I smiled for photographs, wrote the checks, and ignored the small ache in my chest. After they moved into their new house, she began to call me Les. At first I thought it was natural. Young people build their own rhythm. But over time I noticed that every call I made went through her. "Eric's busy," she'd say. "He'll call you back." He rarely did. When Helen died, I felt a loneliness that words couldn't reach. I used to walk into rooms expecting her to be there, humming while folding laundry. But she was gone, and in her absence the house became a museum of memories. So when Eric suggested I move in with him, I said yes, too quickly. The first few months were fine. Madison was polite, organized, efficient. But her politeness was the kind that required gratitude in return. If she served me tea, I had to thank her twice. If she drove me to the doctor, she'd mention it at every dinner. I began to notice her tone change when her friends visited. "We're taking care of Dad," she'd say, the words soaked in self-congratulation. I wasn't her father. I was her project. One evening she came home excited. "Luke, I've been thinking," she said, sitting across from me. "We should merge our finances. It'll make taxes easier. You trust us, right?" I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I told myself it was practical. I told myself she meant well. But in her eyes I saw something calculating, a flicker of ownership. The day I signed those papers, I didn't know I was signing away my peace. At first, it was little things. The TV moved from my room to theirs, for space. My books packed into boxes for tidiness. My meals served later than everyone else's, for convenience. Slowly, my existence was rearranged, until I was a guest in the house I helped to pay for. Eric didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but love makes men cowardly. Whenever I tried to speak to him, he'd squeeze my shoulder and say, "Dad, you know how she is. She likes order." Order. That's what they called it when they took control of my life. I remember one night sitting at the kitchen table after they'd gone to bed. The refrigerator hummed softly, the only sound in the house. I looked at the faint reflection of myself in the window. An old man in his own home, out of place, out of voice. Helen's voice came back to me then, clear as a church bell. "Don't let comfort turn into captivity, Luke." But I already had. When Madison laughed that night and switched off my hearing aid, it wasn't just humiliation. It was the final act in a play that had been rehearsing for years. The slow erosion of respect disguised as care. I realized then that she hadn't stolen my dignity all at once. She'd been taking it piece by piece, smile by smile, favor by favor, and I had let her. But no more. The next morning, I opened the drawer beside my bed and pulled out a faded folder. Old financial statements, property deeds, insurance forms. My name glared from every page like a forgotten truth. For the first time in years, I smiled. Not out of joy, but out of understanding. Madison had spent years silencing me. She was about to learn what real silence sounded like, the kind that empties everything she thinks she owns. Days began to fold into one another after that night. The house looked the same. Polished counters, perfect furniture, the faint smell of air freshener that never quite hid the tension. But something had changed inside me. I had stopped expecting respect. And when you stop expecting, you start observing. I began to see things I hadn't before. How Madison's tone softened only when guests were around. How Eric's laughter grew louder when she mocked me, like he was auditioning for approval. How the children had started to look at me the way she did. Half pity, half irritation. It happened in small, quiet humiliations. If I forgot my glass of water at the table, Madison would sigh loudly and say, "You really can't remember anything, can you?" If I walked slowly down the hall, she'd tap her watch in front of the kids. Once, when I turned on the TV without using the right remote, she snapped, "Let me handle it, Luke. Technology isn't your friend." That one stayed with me. I used to design circuit boards, climb power lines in the snow, repair transformers during blackouts. But now, in my own home, I wasn't trusted with a remote. I tried to laugh at it sometimes, but laughter feels wrong when you're the only one not in on the joke. Eric didn't defend me. He'd smile awkwardly and say, "She doesn't mean it, Dad." But she did mean it. Every word, every gesture, each one chipped away at what little presence I had left. Even the walls seemed to listen differently now. When I walked through the hallway, I could hear her whispering on the phone. "He's harmless," she'd say to friends. "Just a bit slow these days." That word, slow, followed me around like a scent. It turned me from a man into a burden. I started spending more time outside, just sitting on the porch with my coffee, watching cars pass. Neighbors would wave and I'd wave back, pretending I was just another retiree enjoying his morning. None of them knew that inside that house I was invisible. One afternoon, as I sat there, I overheard Madison talking to a delivery man. "Just leave it by the door," she said. "My father-in-law likes to wander around. We don't want him tripping." I wasn't wondering. I was listening. And what I heard that day told me everything I needed to know. In her eyes, I wasn't family. I was liability. That evening, Eric came home late from work. He dropped his keys on the counter and poured himself a drink. "Rough day," he said. "Mine too," I replied quietly. He chuckled without asking why. That was the difference between us. I noticed everything. He noticed nothing. Later that night, I stood by the window, watching the reflection of the family gathered around the TV. They laughed at a sitcom while I stood in the dim kitchen light, a ghost watching his own life from the other side of the glass. That's when I realized something. The silence she had given me wasn't empty. It was full. Full of every insult, every dismissal, every moment I let pass. And within that fullness, Something sharp began to form. The next morning I went to the local park. There's a bench there facing the lake. Helen and I used to sit there on weekends. I closed my eyes and imagined her voice. "Luke," she'd say, "don't fight them with words. Fight them with peace that makes them wonder." That peace became my disguise. I returned home calmer than ever. Madison noticed. "You're quiet lately," she said, pouring herself coffee. "Just thinking," I answered. "About what?" "About everything I gave this family," I said. She smiled in that polished way of hers. "You mean everything we've built together?" I didn't correct her. The truth doesn't need to shout. It waits. Over the next few days, I began sorting through my drawers. Bills, receipts, letters from old employers, all neatly folded history. I organized them quietly while they slept. I think Madison assumed I was just being obsessive. Let her think so. The best revenge begins when your enemy still thinks they're winning. By the weekend, she decided to invite friends for dinner. "It'll be nice to have everyone see how well we're doing," she said, walking past me. "Make sure you wear something tidy, Luke." I almost laughed. I used to wear safety harnesses 50 feet in the air. Now I was being instructed on shirts. Still, I smiled. Of course. That night, her friends filled the house with perfume and chatter. They admired her decorations, her cooking, her lifestyle. When someone asked if the house was hers, she laughed and said, "Ours, though we're still paying off a bit my father-in-law helped with." A bit. I looked at her from across the room and thought, "You don't even realize the deed still carries my name." As the evening went on, she told a story about me, how I once put salt instead of sugar in coffee, how I sometimes forget to turn off lights. Everyone laughed. I smiled politely, letting the laughter roll past me like wind over stone. Inside, I was counting, not minutes but years of patience. After they left, she turned to me, tipsy from wine and praise. "See, Luke, you had fun, didn't you?" "I did," I said evenly. "It's nice to be the entertainment." She blinked, unsure if I was joking. Then she shrugged and walked away. That night, as the house went dark, I felt a strange clarity. Their mockery wasn't destroying me anymore. It was refining me, like heat to metal. The more they laughed, the stronger I became. Because now I was listening not as a victim, but as a man preparing to end the noise forever. And when silence finally came, it wouldn't be mine alone. The house was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest, making every breath sound louder than it should. Madison had cooked dinner, roast chicken, steamed vegetables, everything placed with her usual precision. The table shimmered under soft light, but beneath that glow, something darker waited. I took my usual seat at the far end, the one nearest to the window. Eric sat beside her, already scrolling through his phone. The children whispered and giggled over something I couldn't quite catch. My hearing aid had been giving me trouble all day, buzzing faintly like a trapped fly. Madison noticed. "Luke, that thing's loud again," she said, wrinkling her nose. "I'll fix it later," I replied quietly. She sighed dramatically. "Or I could fix it for you right now." I thought she was joking, but she stood, walked behind me, and with one quick flick, turned it off. Silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. The clatter of cutlery vanished, replaced by the movement of mouths. Her lips forming words I couldn't hear. Eric's laughter delayed. The kids grinning as though they'd seen something funny. The whole world moved but made no sound. For a moment, I just sat there, hands still on the table, staring at the steam rising from my plate. I wanted to reach up, to turn the hearing aid back on, but my fingers felt heavy. The air was thick with humiliation. I looked at Madison. She was smiling, not kindly, but with satisfaction. Then she leaned close to Eric and whispered something. He chuckled, shaking his head. I could see the muscles in her jaw tighten when she smiled again. That smile was her crown, and I apparently was the court jester. The children whispered and laughed, their voices invisible to me. For the first time in my life, I wished I couldn't read lips. I took a bite of the chicken, though I could barely taste it. The food turned dry in my mouth. My throat burned, but I forced myself to swallow. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me broken. When dinner ended, I stood slowly. No one looked up. Madison collected plates, humming a song she knew I couldn't hear. Eric disappeared into the living room, phone in hand. I walked to my room, closed the door, and locked it quietly. Inside, the silence followed me, but now it belonged to me. I removed the hearing aid and placed it on the dresser. For the first time, I didn't turn it back on. I didn't need to hear them anymore. I didn't need their noise, their laughter, their pity. In that silence, memories began to replay. Years of work, years of giving, years of small humiliations that I had treated as normal. I saw myself younger, standing in the snow outside the power plant, holding a thermos of coffee Helen had made. I saw Eric's first bike, the one I bought by selling my old wristwatch. I saw Madison at the wedding, smiling for the cameras while I handed over another check. Every act of love had turned into permission for disrespect. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the faint reflection of myself in the mirror. My face looked older than I remembered. Wrinkles had carved maps of patience I never meant to draw. My hands, Hatara trembled. Not from weakness, but from restraint. For years I had mistaken silence for strength. I thought endurance was virtue. But now I understood something Helen once told me. A man's silence means nothing if it protects the wrong people. That night, the silence began to shift. It was no longer her weapon. It was mine. I reached into the drawer and pulled out the folder I had been quietly preparing. Every document, every signature, every account, all organized, all under my name. I had started this work weeks ago without realizing why. Now I knew. I ran my hand over the stack of papers, feeling the dry texture of the future. My heart was steady, my mind clear. This was not revenge, it was restoration. Through the window, I could see the faint light from the living room. Their shadows moved on the wall, Madison pouring wine, Eric laughing at something on the screen. It struck me how little they needed me anymore, how easily they had turned me into decoration. I whispered to the dark, "You made me silent, Madison. Now I'll teach you what silence really sounds like." The next morning I would start what I now knew I had been preparing for all along. I would make a single call, not loud, not dramatic, just a calm voice to an old friend who still respected me. Dean. Helen's voice echoed in my mind one last time. "Don't raise your voice, Luke. Raise your worth." So I sat there, in the night without sound, surrounded by stillness so complete it almost felt holy. The clock ticked in slow rhythm, the only sound left to remind me I was still here, still alive, still capable of reclaiming everything I had given away. And as the house slept beyond that door, I smiled for the first time in years. Not because I forgave them, but because I finally heard something worth listening to again. My own resolve. Morning came with the faint smell of rain. The sky outside was the color of pewter, heavy but still. I sat by the window with my coffee, watching drops slide down the glass. The house was quiet, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that comes after something is broken and no one wants to mention it. Madison's laughter floated faintly from the kitchen as she spoke on the phone. I couldn't hear the words clearly, but her tone was bright, polished, the same voice she used for clients, or when pretending to care. Eric had already left for work. His schedule was predictable, like everything about him. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling the bitterness on my tongue. Last night's silence hadn't left me. It had settled inside me like an anchor. There was no anger anymore, only clarity. When you live long enough, you learn that anger burns too fast to be useful. Clarity, though, that can build empires or end them. I looked across the room at the folder I'd left on the dresser. It seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. Inside it were the blueprints of my life, property deeds, savings accounts, investment statements. Years of careful work, every line a story, every signature a scar. For the first time, I didn't see paper. I saw power. It struck me how blind I had been all this time. Madison thought she had everything: the house, the accounts, the image of control. But she had never noticed whose name still sat quietly on the top of every page. Mine. That was my quiet realization. She hadn't stolen anything. I had given it all away, and what is given can be taken back. I placed the coffee mug down and opened the folder. My hands moved with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't trembling anymore. I wasn't afraid. I was preparing. The phone rang once. I picked it up, dialed a familiar number. Dean Carter speaking. Dean, it's Luke. There was a pause, then warmth. Luke, my old friend, it's been too long. His voice reminded me of a time when people still treated me as capable. Dean and I had worked together decades ago before he became a lawyer. He was the kind of man who never forgot a favor, and I had done him a few. I need some guidance, I said simply. Of course, legal or personal? Both, I replied, but let's start with legal. I could almost hear his smile over the line. That sounds serious. Tell me when you can come in. Tomorrow morning, I said, quietly. Understood. When I hung up, I felt something shift inside me, the return of authority. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about balance. Years of silence had tilted everything in their favor. It was time to straighten the scale. Later that afternoon, Madison knocked on my door. I turned my hearing aid off before answering. Luke, she said, peeking in. You didn't touch lunch. Are you feeling okay? I smiled faintly. Better than ever. She tilted her head, suspicious. Well, that's good. Eric's been worried. Has he? I asked. Her smile froze for half a second. Of course. She lingered as if waiting for me to ask something. When I didn't, she left, closing the door gently behind her. I sat there a while longer, staring at the door. Her tone was changing, cautious, uncertain. She could sense something, but didn't know what. Power has a sound, even when it's silent. That evening, Eric came home tired. He asked about dinner, about bills, about work. He didn't ask about me. That was fine. I had stopped expecting him to. After they went to bed, I walked through the house slowly. The lights were dim, the walls lined with photographs, family vacations, birthdays, all the moments that had been built on my foundation. My reflection followed me from frame to frame, older now, but no longer invisible. I paused at one photo. Eric, at 16, standing beside the first car I'd bought him. His smile had been pure then, untouched by pride. I touched the glass and whispered, I wish you'd stayed. That boy. Then I turned away. In the living room, the moonlight fell across the grand piano. Madison insisted on buying, even though she never learned to play. I pressed a single key. The note rang out softly, echoing through the still air. One sound, clean, simple, unapologetic. That's what I wanted my next move to be. Quiet, decisive, impossible to ignore. When I returned to my room, I took out a notepad and began writing a list. Not of money or possessions, but of lessons. Every mistake I'd made. Every time I'd chosen peace over self-respect. Every time I'd believed silence was love. At the bottom I wrote, silence can protect dignity or destroy it. The choice is in the timing. I closed the notebook and slipped it inside the folder. The plan wasn't complete yet, but the man who would finish it had already awakened. Tomorrow, Dean would help me begin the process of reclaiming what was mine. And when it was done, I wouldn't need to raise my voice or prove my worth. The papers would speak louder than any words Madison had ever thrown at me. That night, as I lay in bed, the rain outside softened into a steady rhythm. I listened to it like a promise. Each drop fell with the sound of a clock counting down. For years I'd feared the silence. Now I realized it was the most powerful sound I'd ever heard. Dean's office smelled faintly of leather and old paper. the kind of scent that makes you trust a man before he even speaks. The morning light streamed through the blinds, striping his mahogany desk with lines of gold and shadow. He looked up as I entered, his expression a mixture of surprise and warmth. "Luke," he said, standing to shake my hand, "you look different." "I finally slept," I replied. He chuckled. "That's a rare luxury at our age." I sat down across from him, the folder pressed tight under my arm. It wasn't heavy, but it felt like the weight of my entire life. Dean gestured toward it. "That looks serious." "It is," I said. "I need to reclaim what's mine." He leaned forward slightly. "Start from the beginning." I told him everything. The joint accounts, the property transfer papers, the so-called efficiency Madison had insisted on. I spoke plainly, without anger, because anger would have distracted from the point. He listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes. When I finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed his chin. "Legally speaking," he said, "you're in a very strong position. If your name is still primary on these documents, you hold the rights. You never surrendered ownership. You just shared access." "Shared," I repeated softly. "That's a generous word for what I did." He smiled faintly. "You trusted. That's what fathers do. But trust doesn't erase legal identity. Everything you worked for still belongs to you, Luke." For a long moment, I said nothing. Just those words, "belongs to you," seemed to echo louder than anything I'd heard in years. "So what do I do?" He slid the folder closer, scanning the pages. "We'll start with the bank accounts. We'll remove her access first. Then we'll secure the property deed and update the investment portfolios. Quietly. No notices to anyone until it's done." I nodded slowly. "I want it silent." "Of course," he said. "You've earned the right to silence." That line stayed with me long after I left his office. The next few days moved with deliberate rhythm. I visited the bank, greeted the manager who'd known me for decades. He smiled, shook my hand, and said, "Mr. Anderson, it's been a while." "It's time to clean up a few things," I said. There was no resistance, no complication. My signature was still the final authority. One by one, I signed the forms. With each stroke of the pen, something inside me straightened. By the end of the hour, every account that once had Madison's name now stood under mine alone. She didn't even know it yet. Walking out of that bank, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not proud, just free. The world looked different when you remembered it still belonged to you. That night at dinner, Madison was in good spirits. She poured wine, told Eric about her plans to redecorate the living room. "We should get a new couch," she said. "The one your father bought looks dated." I smiled faintly at my plate. "Your father bought?" She said it without realizing how literal that truth was. Eric nodded absently. "Whatever you want." I ate quietly, the sound of their conversation fading into background noise. The same woman who had mocked my hearing now spoke unaware that every word rested on a foundation she no longer owned. After dinner, she passed me the bills. "Luke, can you check this? I think one of the payments bounced." I took the paper, scanning it calmly. The faint panic in her voice was almost hidden, but I caught it. "Don't worry," I said, handing it back. "Some accounts close themselves when they've served their purpose." She looked at me sharply. "What does that mean?" "Nothing important," I said. "Just the sound of things correcting themselves." Her eyes lingered on me for a moment longer before she turned away. The air in the room had changed, subtle but undeniable. She could feel the ground shifting, though she didn't know where the cracks were forming. That night, I sat on the porch again. The wind was cold but clean. I could hear the rustle of leaves, the hum of distant traffic, the faint creak of the old swing Helen used to love. I closed my eyes and let the sounds fill me. Ownership, I realized, isn't just about paper. It's about presence. It's about the right to exist without apology. For too long, I had lived like a tenant in my own life. Now, with each step, I was moving back in. The next morning, Dean called. "It's done," he said. Simply, "The transfers are secure. You're the sole owner again." I thanked him quietly. There was nothing left to say. When I hung up, I looked around the room. The furniture Madison had chosen, the curtains she'd picked, the photographs she'd arranged to make this place hers. And I smiled, because soon she'd realize what I had just remembered. She'd been decorating someone else's house all along. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The air outside had that gray, uncertain stillness that comes just before the world decides to wake. I brewed my coffee quietly, savoring its warmth. For once, the house didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a place I was preparing to leave, not in defeat, but in peace. I dressed carefully, pressed shirt, clean jacket, old watch that Helen gave me the year Eric was born. I hadn't worn it in years. It had stopped ticking long ago. I wound it gently, and to my surprise, the second hand began to move again, slow but steady. "Guess we're both coming back to life," I murmured. By 8 o'clock, I was standing outside the downtown branch of the bank I'd used for nearly 40 years. The automatic doors hissed open, releasing the familiar scent of carpet and paperwork. The manager, a man named Alan Price, spotted me almost immediately. "Mr. Anderson," he said, smiling broadly as he walked over. "It's been far too long." I shook his hand. "Still keeping this place standing, Alan?" "Barely," he laughed. "What brings you in?" "Just housekeeping," I said. "Some adjustments to my accounts." He nodded knowingly. "We can handle that. Please come to my office." Inside, the room looked almost exactly as I remembered. Framed certificates, a bowl of mints no one ever ate, and the hum of the printer that always ran out of ink at the wrong time. I sat down while he typed my information into the computer. "So," Alan said, glancing at the screen, "everything's still in your name. Savings, investments, property escrow. You've done well keeping things organized." I smiled faintly. "I like knowing where things stand." He leaned back, adjusting his glasses. "You've also got linked access for 2 secondary users. Would you like to keep that arrangement?" "No," I said quietly. "Remove them. All of them." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Of course. May I ask the reason?" I met his gaze evenly. "Because I've been far too generous for far too long." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Understood, Mr. Anderson." While he typed, I looked around his office. The rhythm of the keyboard, the faint tap of rain on the window, the calm hum of the air conditioner. It all felt like music now. Every sound meant movement, change, freedom. When he finished, he printed a few papers and turned them toward me. "You'll need to sign these to finalize the access removal." I took the pen. My hand didn't shake. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. Alan gathered the forms, slid them into a folder, and smiled. "Everything's done. The accounts are now private again. Only you have authority." I exhaled slowly, the weight of years leaving my chest. "Thank you, Alan." He studied me for a moment, then said softly, "You know, Mr. Anderson, most people your age come in here worried about running out of money. You look like a man who's just remembered it's his." I smiled. "Maybe I have." He laughed gently. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." When I left the office, the world outside looked different. The colors sharper, the sounds clearer. Even the traffic noise felt alive. I hadn't realized how much of my hearing I'd lost. Not from age, but from neglecting myself. I stopped by a bakery across the street, bought a small loaf of bread, and sat on a bench outside. I tore off a piece and watched the pigeons gather. For a moment, I imagined Helen sitting beside me. "You'd like this," I whispered. "The quiet, the control, the calm after the storm." A few hours later, I returned home. Madison was in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. She was frowning. "Yes, I'm sure there's been a mistake," she said sharply. "It shows the account's been restricted. No, I didn't authorize that." Her eyes met mine as I walked in. I gave her a polite nod. "Morning." She covered the phone's mic. "Luke, did you touch the accounts?" I poured myself water. I just made sure they were tidy. Tidy? Her voice cracked. You froze our funds. Our? I repeated softly. You mean mine. She stared at me, her expression flickering between disbelief and anger. Eric will hear about this. I expect he will, I said calmly. He always does. Eventually. She stormed out of the room, her heels striking the tile like small thunderclaps. I stood there, sipping water, letting the moment settle. The house had finally fallen quiet again, but this time it was the silence of justice, not humiliation. That evening, Eric confronted me. Dad, Madison says the accounts. Yes, I interrupted gently. They're back under my name, as they were meant to be. Why? He demanded. Because I remembered who built them. He didn't speak for a long time. Then finally he muttered, You can't just... I can, I said, looking him straight in the eye. And I did. He left without another word. I watched him go. The same boy I'd once carried on my shoulders now looking at me like a stranger. But it didn't hurt this time. It simply felt inevitable. The distance that always grows when truth replaces comfort. That night, I stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street. The lamp outside flickered, and for a moment, the light reflected off the glass-framed photo of Helen on my desk. She was smiling. Not the way she used to, but the way I imagined she would now. Proud, knowing. I whispered, It started, Helen. Finally. And in that stillness I could almost hear her reply, like a breath on the wind. I told you, Luke, silence only hurts when it belongs to the wrong person. The house felt heavier that night. Madison didn't speak to me during dinner, and Eric's words came out clipped, mechanical, the way people talk when they're avoiding something real. The children watched us in silence, sensing what adults pretend doesn't exist. Tension thick enough to touch. I ate slowly, each bite deliberate. When I finished, I excused myself, saying I was tired. It wasn't a lie, but exhaustion wasn't the kind that sleep could fix. It was the kind that comes after years of swallowing your own voice. In my room, the light from the hallway cast a thin strip across the floor. I sat at my desk, opened the drawer, and took out the old stationery Helen used to write letters on. The paper smelled faintly of lavender. It had yellowed with time, but it was sturdy, like her. I smoothed the first sheet and picked up my pen. For a long while, I just stared at the blank page. I wasn't sure how to begin. How do you summarize a lifetime in a few lines? Finally, I wrote, Dear Eric, if you're reading this, I've already gone. Don't be alarmed. This isn't punishment. It's peace. I spent most of my life giving. I gave you time, love, security, and patience. I gave until I forgot that love doesn't mean disappearance. Somewhere between your childhood and your marriage, I stopped being your father and became a shadow in your home. None of this is to blame you. We all let comfort dull our gratitude. But there comes a time when a man must reclaim the silence he once surrendered. Everything that remains, the accounts, the house, the investments, now belongs to me again. I haven't taken them to hurt you. I've taken them to remind you that respect has value and every gift deserves memory. I've left instructions with Dean Carter. He'll manage the transition when the time is right. Tell Madison that I forgive her, not because she earned it, but because I refuse to carry her weight any longer. Tell her that silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's a man choosing peace over noise. Take care of the children. Raise them with patience, not pride. Teach them that laughter loses its sweetness when it's used to wound. Love, Dad. When I finished, I folded the paper carefully, sliding it into an envelope. My hand brushed over Helen's handwriting on the corner of an old notebook. Kindness is only weakness when forgotten. I smiled faintly. You were right again, I whispered. Then I opened a second page and began another letter. This one for Dean. Dean, when you receive this, please execute the documents we discussed. Sell the remaining shares. Transfer half of the liquid, assets to the trust we created for Eric's children. Not to Eric, not to Madison. Let it activate 5 years from now. By then, they'll understand what work means. As for the house, it's yours to manage. Donate it when the time feels right, not to charity, to a place that teaches respect, like a community library or a veteran's home. Somewhere quiet, somewhere that still values silence. And Dean, thank you. You reminded me that law still recognizes dignity when people forget it. Luke Anderson. When both letters were sealed, I placed them inside the brown leather folder that had followed me since the day I retired. Then I sat there, staring at it for a long time. The folder looked ordinary, but it contained the story of a man learning that love without boundaries turns into servitude. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. The first drops of rain began to tap against the window, slow and rhythmic like a heartbeat. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening. For years I had been afraid of this silence, the kind that filled every room after Helen died. But now it was different. It was steady. It was mine. In that stillness I thought of Eric as a boy, his small hand gripping mine, the way his eyes lit up when I taught him to ride a bike. Somewhere along the way, that boy had become a man who mistook my patience for weakness. I didn't hate him for it. I pitied him, because someday he'd look around and realize what real emptiness sounded like. Not the kind made by silence, but the kind made by absence. I folded my clothes neatly into a suitcase. I didn't need much. A few shirts, my passport, a photograph of Helen, and the watch that still ticked softly. Before leaving the room, I took one last look at the photo on my dresser, the one of all of us smiling at Eric's wedding. I remember how proud I'd felt that day. Pride can blind you. Love can too. I turned off the light, leaving the room bathed in silver from the moon. The letter sat on the desk, waiting like truth that couldn't be silenced anymore. Tomorrow morning I would leave this house quietly, the same way I had lived in it for years, without noise, without goodbye, only purpose. I woke before dawn. The world outside was still dark, the horizon only beginning to pale with the promise of morning. I moved quietly through the house, the way a man walks through a memory, careful not to disturb what's already gone. The suitcase sat by the door, small but heavy with finality. I looked around the room one last time. Everything was in its place. The photograph of Helen, the folder on the desk, the faint imprint of my presence in the worn chair near the window. Soon even those traces would fade. I turned off the light. In the hallway, I paused outside Eric and Madison's room. I could hear their faint breathing through the door. 2 people sleeping soundly inside a house that was no longer theirs. For a moment, I wondered if I should leave a note somewhere more visible, but then I realized, no, they'd find it when they were ready to see. Truth, like sunrise, arrives whether you want it to or not. Downstairs, the air was cool. The grandfather clock ticked softly, counting down the seconds until I stopped belonging to this house. I placed my hearing aid on the table by the entryway. I didn't need it anymore. The silence that had once humiliated me had become my armor. Before stepping out, I ran my hand along the banister I'd installed decades ago when Eric was small enough to slide down it. The wood was smooth now, polished by years of use. I smiled faintly. "Goodbye, old friend," I whispered. Outside, the street was empty except for a single street lamp flickering against the gray sky. The air smelled of wet asphalt and distant rain. I breathed deeply, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped by the act of staying alive. I felt awake. A taxi waited near the curb, engine humming softly. The driver, a young man with kind eyes, stepped out to take my bag. "Airport?" he asked. "Yes," I said, handing him the suitcase. "But take the long way." He looked surprised, but nodded. "You got it?" As the car pulled away, I glanced back at the house through the rear window. The windows glowed faintly, the way they always did before sunrise. I remembered the laughter that used to fill those rooms when Helen was alive, the way Eric used to race through the hallway calling my name. The house had once been love, then duty, then silence. Now it was just a building, a shell waiting to learn what emptiness really sounded like. I turned away. The road stretched ahead, smooth and wet under the headlights. We drove past the park where Helen and I used to sit by the lake. The bench was still there. I almost asked the driver to stop, but some places are better left in memory. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. I didn't need to look. I knew who it was. I let it ring. Then, after a moment, it stopped, the sound fading into the hum of the road. At the airport, the driver carried my bag to the curb. "You traveling far?" he asked. "Far enough," I said. He smiled. "Good for you. Most folks your age don't like change." "Change isn't the hard part," I said. "It's realizing how long you waited for it." Inside the terminal, everything moved with mechanical precision, the rhythm of departure and return. I bought a one-way ticket to Maine, to a small coastal town Helen had always wanted to visit but never did. I'd told myself for years that we'd go one day. One day had finally arrived. Late, but mine. As I waited at the gate, I noticed an older couple sitting nearby, holding hands and sharing a thermos of coffee. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Their silence was full, warm, gentle, alive. It reminded me of what love used to feel like before it became something to endure. When my flight was called, I stood slowly. My knees ached, but the pain felt honest. Every step I took now belonged to me. On the plane, I chose the window seat. The engine's hum filled the cabin, steady, familiar. I looked out at the runway lights flickering through the mist. For years, I'd watched other people move on, telling myself I was too old to start again. But peace doesn't care about age. It only waits for courage. As the plane lifted off, the city fell away, streets turning to lines, houses to dots, the life I'd built shrinking beneath the clouds. Somewhere below, that house still stood, filled with people who thought ownership meant possession. They'd learn soon enough that the truest things in life can't be taken, only earned. I took out the photograph of Helen and held it to the window. The sunlight broke through the clouds just then, washing the picture in gold. I smiled. "We made it, Helen," I whispered. "You were right. Silence wasn't the end. It was the beginning." The plane climbed higher, the sound of the engines blending with the pulse in my chest. I closed my eyes and let it carry me, not away from my life, but finally toward it. The morning after I left, the world must have looked the same from their windows. The same porch, the same maple trees, the same morning light spilling across the kitchen counter. But something was missing, and they'd soon realize it. I wasn't there to see their faces, but I could imagine them. Madison discovering the empty chair at breakfast, Eric calling out my name with half-hearted concern, the children whispering questions no one wanted to answer. That house had always run on noise, the clatter of control, the hum of routine, the laughter that mocked more than it comforted. Without me, it must have sounded hollow. I was sitting on a wooden bench at the small coastal inn I'd checked into the night before when my phone began to buzz. The screen lit up with Eric's name. For a moment, I simply watched it ring. Then I turned it face down on the table and let it fade into silence. I didn't need to hear his voice to know its tone. Confusion first, then irritation, then fear. Panic doesn't always scream. Sometimes it starts with disbelief. I poured myself a cup of coffee, letting the steam fog the window beside me. Outside, the sea was calm, gray-blue under the morning sun. I could hear gulls calling, the soft slap of waves against the shore. Every sound here felt earned, unhurried, respectful, alive. A few minutes later, another call came. Madison this time. I ignored it too. Then a message buzzed through. One line only. "What did you do, Luke? The accounts are frozen. The lawyer won't answer." I smiled faintly. She was learning what silence sounded like when it didn't belong to her. By noon, Dean called. His voice was calm as ever. "They've been trying to reach you," he said. "I know. They sound desperate." "Desperation," I said, "is just the echo of entitlement when it meets reality." Dean chuckled softly. "You always had a way with words." "I had to. Words were the only thing I had left for a long time." He cleared his throat. "Everything's in motion. The trust is secure and the property transfer's been filed. The letters are with the courier. They'll receive them today." "Good," I said. "Then let the silence do its work." After the call, I walked along the beach. The wind tugged gently at my jacket, carrying the scent of salt and pine. Every step felt lighter, as if the sand itself was erasing the years behind me. By evening, my phone was full of missed calls. Eric, Madison, even numbers I didn't recognize. Probably their bank or friends trying to reach me. I didn't answer any of them. For once, the noise belonged to them. I imagined Madison pacing the kitchen, her voice sharp and rising. "He can't do this. He can't just disappear." And Eric, quieter, uncertain. "He can, Madison. It's his name on everything." A pause. "You mean we have nothing?" "Nothing we didn't borrow." I pictured her sinking into the chair she once called hers, realizing that ownership isn't just a matter of possession. It's a matter of respect. You can't own what you've humiliated. That night, Dean sent me a message. "All settled. Travel safely, old friend." I replied with 2 words. "Thank you." Afterward, I stood by the window of my small room, watching the ocean turn silver under the moon. Somewhere in that rolling water was the sound of my past being washed clean. I thought of Helen, of how she'd warned me not to let silence destroy me, and I realized she'd been right all along. Silence doesn't destroy. It reveals. It shows who panics when the noise stops. In that quiet, I finally understood what freedom sounded like. It wasn't the absence of people. It was the absence of permission. The next morning, a soft knock came at my door. The innkeeper, a kind woman with a warm smile, handed me an envelope. "Courier for you, Mr. Anderson." Inside was a small note from Dean. "Everything went through smoothly. The house now legally belongs to your trust. I'll handle the donation process when the time comes. Enjoy your peace. You've earned it." I folded the note and slipped it into my wallet. "Yes," I whispered, "I've earned it." Later, as I walked down to the pier, I watched the fishermen preparing their boats, their laughter easy and honest. One of them waved. I waved back. There was no mockery in it, just acknowledgement. 2 men who existed without pretense. I sat at the edge of the dock, letting the wind move through my hair. The sea murmured softly beneath me, carrying its endless rhythm. Somewhere, far away, a woman was learning that wealth built on disrespect dissolves faster than salt in water. And a son was learning that love without gratitude sounds like silence. I closed my eyes, feeling the world breathe around me. I didn't need to say anything. The silence spoke louder than words ever could. Morning light spilled across the water like liquid gold. The tide was low, and the air carried the gentle scent of sea salt and pine. I sat on a weathered bench facing the Atlantic, the same spot I'd chosen since arriving in Maine. The bench was old, its paint peeling, but it had a view that reminded me of Grace. Quiet, endless, forgiving. For the first time in years, I could hear everything clearly. The roll of the waves, the rustle of wind through seagrass, the faint cries of gulls circling above. I didn't need my hearing aid anymore. The world finally was speaking to me in the only language that ever mattered. Silence filled with meaning. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth spread through my hands. The innkeeper's husband had given me the mug this morning, saying, "You look like a man who listens more than he talks." I smiled. "These days, that's all I do." He chuckled. "That's the secret to peace, you know. Hearing what doesn't demand to be heard." I nodded. I already knew. The sea stretched endlessly before me, calm but powerful, like a truth that had been patient for too long. I thought of Helen then. Her laughter used to sound like this ocean, soft, steady, eternal. She had always loved the water, even though we'd never made that trip we promised ourselves. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out her photograph, edges worn, the image faded but alive. "You were right, Helen," I whispered. "You always said I'd find peace near the sea." The wind carried her memory like a voice, gentle, teasing. "I also said you'd take too long getting there." I smiled. I did. I sat there for hours, watching the world move slowly. No one hurried here. The fishermen greeted the day as though time had always been their friend. A child tossed pebbles into the surf, laughing when they skipped. Life went on, simple, rhythmic, pure. By afternoon, I took a walk along the shoreline. The water lapped gently at my shoes. Every step left a temporary imprint that vanished seconds later. It reminded me of legacy, how even the deepest marks fade when they're made for the wrong reasons. I thought of Eric then. I hadn't spoken to him since leaving. Dean said he'd received my letter, that he'd tried to reach me several times. He'd even driven to the bank, demanding answers. But answers don't live in offices. They live in memory and in silence. I didn't hate him. I didn't even resent Madison anymore. People act out of what they understand. She understood control. He understood avoidance. I had understood love. And now, finally, boundaries. Near sunset, I sat on a rock at the water's edge. The sea was turning orange beneath the dying light. I closed my eyes and listened. The sound of waves folding over themselves was the same rhythm that had once comforted me in childhood. Before work, before fatherhood, before disappointment. The sound that reminded me that no matter what we build or lose, the world keeps breathing. A gull landed near me, cocking its head. I tossed it a crumb of bread. "You know," I said softly, "for years I thought forgiveness was something you give to others. Turns out it's something you give yourself." It fluttered away without a sound, leaving only ripples behind. As darkness began to settle, I walked back to the inn. The lights in the windows glowed warm against the fading dusk. I passed a small chapel along the way. White walls, a bell tower silhouetted against the twilight. I stepped inside, drawn by instinct rather than faith. The place was empty. A few candles flickered near the altar, their flames swaying like gentle conversations with God. I sat in the back pew and closed my eyes. I didn't pray for forgiveness or blessing. I prayed for gratitude, for every scar, every silence, every lesson disguised as pain. When I opened my eyes again, I felt lighter. Outside, the stars had begun to appear, scattered across the sky like words I hadn't yet said. I looked out toward the sea one last time before heading inside. The waves shimmered beneath the moonlight, whispering against the shore. I realized then that I could tell the difference between each sound. The crash of the surf, the hiss of foam retreating, the far-off echo of a buoy bell. Each sound was a reminder that I was still here, still part of something vast and alive. I took one deep breath of salt air and whispered, "This is what freedom sounds like." Back in my room, I placed Helen's photograph on the nightstand beside the ticking watch. The same steady rhythm filled the quiet space. I lay down, the sheets cool and crisp, the hum of the sea drifting through the window. I didn't need anything more. No apologies, no revenge, no audience. The silence that once humiliated me had become the most honest companion I'd ever known. Tomorrow, I'd walk to the docks and ask one of the fishermen if they needed an extra hand. Maybe they'd say yes, maybe they wouldn't. Either way, I'd still have the ocean. As I closed my eyes, the last thing I heard was the sound of the waves. Soft, endless, forgiving. And for the first time in my life, I didn't just hear peace, I belonged to it.